your doctor with no government bureaucrat anywhere near you. And I'm going to suggest, Mr. President, the difference is those plans come from listening to the people. Obamacare is the opposite of listening to the people.
The gentleman from Texas yield for a question.
I am happy to yield to my friend from Utah for a question, and I will return with yet more tweets at a later point.
So, Senator Cruz, I've come with some updates from the outside world, updates based on what I'm hearing from my constituents at home. You may be interested in learning, Senator Cruz, that just today, in the last 12 hours or so, my office has received nearly 1,100 emails, 1,093 to be precise. Now, almost every single one of those is asking us to do whatever we can, do whatever it takes to defund Obamacare. People are asking us to fund government, keep government functioning, but to defund Obamacare. I also have some news from a local paper in the state of Utah. This is from the Box Elder News Journal in the northern part of my state. In an article written by Mike Nelson, an associate editor with the Box Elder News Journal, we read about Brigham City moving to adjust its pay, to cut its payroll in order to avoid certain Obamacare provisions. I'm going to quote just from a part of it here. It says, "Changes are coming for paid on-call employees of Brigham City's Emergency Services Department in an effort by the department and the city to avoid employee eligibility for health care under the Affordable Care Act. Back in February, it became apparent the ACA, or for those of you who see the newspapers, Obamacare, was going to dramatically impact the way we manage our fire and ambulance crews," said Emergency Services Director Jim Buchanan while addressing the issue at an August 1st City Council meeting. This is one of many examples of not just businesses but also local governments that are having to make cuts in their payroll in order to adjust for this law. This is having a real impact on real people. It's having an impact also on students. I received a message from a student in Utah named Sarah. Sarah today, a college student, writes, "I'm a student facing a shrinking job market with fewer options. Now it seems Obamacare is going to force me, as a healthy young person, to pay more to keep the president's health plan functioning. How is that fair?" she asked rhetorically. Well, Sarah, it's not. It's not fair. And Sarah, I would add to that, we have this health care law. It's called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. The idea of it is that it's supposed to make health care more affordable. What we have found in recent months is that it's going to make health care less affordable, with premium hikes expected around the country. What we're seeing is that this law will make health care not only less affordable, it's also fundamentally unfair. It's unfair in that it's forcing a lot of people to have cuts made to their wages, cuts made to their hours. In many cases, people are losing access to health plans that they've enjoyed for years. In some cases, they're even seeing that they will no longer have access to the same physician or other health care provider that they've enjoyed for years. So this is a law that, while touted as making health care somehow more affordable, is actually making it less affordable. And it's also being implemented in a manner that will make our health care system fundamentally unfair. Within my state, the state of Utah, we have no fewer than 5 school districts and 3 universities that have been announcing cuts in their hours and cuts in their number of employees, all in response to this law. Now, it's interesting that what we're discussing here today, much of what we've been discussing today has been on the upcoming cloture vote. There have been those who have argued that if you want to support the continuing resolution passed by the House of Representatives, remember, this is the continuing resolution that will keep our federal government funded while defunding Obamacare. That if you want to support that, that you must vote yes on the cloture vote on the bill. Well, that's an interesting take on it, because notwithstanding the fact that some in my party have been making that suggestion, it's anticipated that Senator Harry Reid, the gentleman from Nevada, who's currently serving as the Senate Majority Leader, that Senator Reid and 53 Democratic allies will, as I understand it, all be voting for cloture on that bill. So that begs the question, are those same people who are suggesting that if you support the House-passed continuing resolution, the one that funds government, keeps government funded while defunding Obamacare, that you have to vote yes on cloture on the bill? Does that mean that Harry Reid and the 53 Democrats who are likely to follow him are also supporting the House-passed continuing resolution, the one that keeps government funded while defunding Obamacare? I find that a little strange. I find it a little counterintuitive. And I think it's important that we remember, that we continually remind ourselves of what this is about. When this continuing resolution passed by the House last week, heroically in my opinion, it showed a real strong sense of leadership by Speaker John Boehner, by the other Republican leaders in the House of Representatives, by the rank and file members of the House who voted for this legislation. When they voted for this legislation to keep government funded while defunding Obamacare, they stood with the American people who had asked them for relief from this bill. The American people had been telling them, look, we need help. They had been asking, how many of us will have to see our hours cut? How many of us will have to experience wage cuts? How many of us will have to lose access to the health care that we've enjoyed for many, many years before Congress acts? Well, the House of Representatives did act. The body within our government, the branch within Congress that is most responsive to the American people, acted to protect the American people from this harmful law while simultaneously keeping the federal government operating. Now that that has happened and that that bill is moving over to the Senate, the ball's in our court, we have a couple of possible responses to that. The first would be we could take it up and we could vote on it as is. We could vote on it just as it was passed by the House. We could vote on it up or down as is without any amendment. That would be fine. I would be fine with that. If that's what we were doing, I'd be voting yes on the cloture vote. Of course I would, and I suspect that my friend, the junior senator from Texas, would as well. There's another option. We could say, well, rather than vote on it as is, let's make adjustments to it. Let's invite amendments. Let's have an open amendment process whereby senators, whether Democrats or Republicans, or the couple of independents that we have, could submit amendments as they deem fit, have those amendments not just proposed, but debated, discussed, and ultimately voted upon. That would be an acceptable alternative. You know, people around here often call this, the United States Senate, the world's deliberative body. They call it that because this is a place where, in theory, we're supposed to have access to an open amendment process. Theoretically, unlimited debate. Is it time-consuming? Yes. Is it cumbersome? Absolutely. Can it be frustrating? Without question. But it's one of the things that distinguishes this body. It's one of the things that makes this the Senate. So if we were to have an open amendment process, it would take a lot of time, and it might even require another all-night session, just like we had a few months ago in connection with the budget resolution. But it would be worth it. It would be entirely acceptable, and I would be voting yes on cloture on the bill if that's what we were faced with. But what we were faced with, what we're being told is going to happen, what we're being prepared to accept, is neither of those options. We're not being given the opportunity to vote yes or no, up or down, on the continuing resolution passed by the House of Representatives, nor are we being given the opportunity to have an open amendment process, one that allows individual senators to propose amendments and have those amendments considered voted on in this body. What we're being told instead is that what we will have is a single amendment brought forward by the Senate Majority Leader. One amendment only. And that amendment, by the way, would strip out the defunding language. It would gut the House-passed continuing resolution of a provision that many would consider the without which not part of the House-passed bill, meaning the part without which the House of Representatives would not have gotten the necessary 218 votes to pass a continuing resolution. That's a problem. That's a problem indeed, because that suggests that by voting for cloture in that posture, where Senator Reid is contemplating allowing neither an open amendment process nor an up or down vote on the House-passed resolution in as-is condition, in either of those circumstances, we would be fine. But we're not getting that. We're getting stuck with something else. He wants to gut the House-passed continuing resolution of the defunding language without any open amendment process and without the opportunity for an up or down vote. So in that circumstance, I don't understand why it would be the case that Republicans would feel that voting yes would be supporting the House of Representatives and voting no would be voting against the House of Representatives. In fact, it seems to me, Senator Cruz, that that would be quite the opposite of that. It seems to me, Senator Cruz, that if one, in fact, wanted to stand behind the House of Representatives and stand behind their willingness to defend the American people and protect them from this harmful law, that at the end of the day, would entail anyone who wanted to stand with the House of Representatives on that point would necessarily need to vote no, if, in fact, Senator Reid does what we expect him to do later this week. Would you agree, Senator Cruz, that that is what one could expect in that circumstance? And would you also agree that Senator Reid is likely to have 53 Democrats going along with him, and that if Senator Reid has 53 Democrats going along with him, doesn't that rather undercut the argument that in order to support the House-passed bill, one must vote yes on the cloture vote, on cloture on the bill?
I thank Senator Lee for his very good question. I think the answer is absolutely yes. If the objective of any Senate Republican is to support the House Republicans, the bill that they passed to defund Obamacare, then you obviously would not vote to allow Majority Leader Harry Reid to strip out all of the operative language and to fund Obamacare with a 51-vote, pure partisan Democratic majority. That's not complicated. It's something, to be honest, every senator in this body understands. The Democrats all understand it. It's why Harry Reid is voting yes on cloture. It's why presumably every Democrat will vote yes on cloture. Why? You know, the reasoning that some of our colleagues have used is, well, a yes vote in cloture says that you support the House of Representatives bill. You support defunding Obamacare. Really? I suppose that means then that Harry Reid suddenly supports defunding Obamacare and that every Democrat suddenly supports defunding Obamacare. Now, my friend Senator Lee, I would be very happy if that were the case. If that interpretation were right, and suddenly Harry Reid and every Democrat supported defunding Obamacare, that'd be terrific. But you know what? We know for a fact it's not the case. We know for a fact it's not the case because they publicly said it. We know for a fact it's not the case because just yesterday I asked for unanimous consent that we simply pass the House bill, and if every Democrat, if Harry Reid supported defunding Obamacare, he wouldn't have objected. Everyone understands that the cloture vote on Friday or Saturday is a vote to allow Harry Reid to fully fund Obamacare, using only a 51-vote majority that allows it to be done on straight partisan lines. There's no confusion about that. Every Democrat understands it. Every Republican understands it. But, you know, there is some confusion. It's not in this body. It is so senators believe, with the American people. Because senators think, well, the politics is confusing enough, the procedural mumbo-jumbo is confusing enough, that I can vote yes, give Harry Reid the ability to defund Obamacare, and at the same time, I can run paid advertisings, as more than a few of our colleagues may well be doing right now, that say, I want to defund Obamacare. You can't do both. You can't hand Harry Reid the ability to fund Obamacare and claim you want to defund it. Pick a side. Pick a position and stand by your beliefs. You know, I'll give an analogy. The House of Representatives passed a bill that cut taxes. And it came over to the Senate. And Majority Leader Harry Reid announced that he wanted to file for cloture on that bill, and then after that happens, he would file an amendment to erase all the tax cuts and to jack up taxes by $1 trillion. And let's suppose he announced this publicly, told everyone, this is what I plan to do. By the way, it's going to be the only amendment. So I'm going to totally gut the House bill, and I'm going to turn a tax cut into a tax increase. Now, Mr. President, I am absolutely certain if that were the case, all 46 Republicans would vote against cloture. So we get the game. Voting to cut off debate is voting to allow the Majority Leader to gut the House bill. So if you're voting for cloture, you're saying, I want the Majority Leader to be able to gut the House bill. But it's even better than that. If you believe, what is it P.T. Barnum said? You can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. You know, there are a lot of members of this body who thinks, some of the people all of the time will be just good enough for me. If I can vote to give Harry Reid the ability to fund Obamacare, and then, beauty of all beauty, when we get to a 51-vote threshold on Obamacare, I can vote against funding Obamacare, so I can go home and say, hey, I voted twice the right way. Of course, I did it in a way that guaranteed 100% we're going to lose, guaranteed that Obamacare will be funded. Now, for that strategy to work depends upon voters being really gullible, voters being confused. And you know one of the great things? Mr. President, I was reading tweets earlier. We're not living, we talked before about we're not living in the 1950s. In many respects, we're not living in the 1950s. One of those respects is we no longer have three big networks that control all the news and limited avenues for the American people to find out what's going on. We've seen a democratization of information. We now have cable TV, more channels, it seems, than you can possibly imagine. You've got avenues like Fox News that get out content that the mainstream media won't cover in an effort to provide fair and balanced news. We've got talk radio. God bless talk radio. An avenue to reach out to millions of Americans going right around the media gatekeepers. And then we've got the internet. We've got social media. We've got Facebook. We've got Twitter. We can disseminate information directly. And you know what? It may have been in the 1950s. One could do some procedural smoke and mirrors. One could hide it in obfuscation, and people wouldn't know. You know, one of the most fascinating things, I suspect, Mr. President, you've probably done this as well because you're an avid student of history, is listening to the old LBJ tapes. And LBJ on tape would be talking to one group, and he'd say, I'm totally with you, I'm totally with you. And he'd say that on tape, and then you get him on tape talking to a group on the other side, I'm totally with you, I'm totally with you. And he tells groups positions 180 degrees opposite of each other. But he could say to one thing and to one the other thing, and they were so different that they'd never get a chance to reconcile. I'm going to suggest, Mr. President, in 2013 it's a lot harder to do. 2013, if you tell one group you're totally with them, you better believe the other group's going to find out about it. In 2013, if you vote Now, some Republicans might. I hope they don't, but some Republicans might. If you vote to give Harry Reid the power to fund Obamacare on a straight partisan 51-vote threshold, then you are voting to fund Obamacare. And I'll tell you this, your constituents are going to know about it. And it's not anything any of us are going to do. It's because our constituents are now engaged directly, are now following this debate directly, and so the ads that say, I'm for defunding Obamacare, while at the same time you're fighting to keep funding Obamacare, that doesn't work in the Internet age. It doesn't work. You know, what is the old line that I try not to lie, I try to tell the truth because it's so hard to keep track of the lies? If you tell people multiple positions, just stand up and fight for what you believe in. We were talking before about Senator Bernie Sanders. I respect the heck out of Bernie Sanders. And actually, and this is a comment that often surprises our friends in the media and even some Democrats, I respect President Obama. I respect the man a great deal because I think he's deeply committed to his principles. I think he has taken political risk for his principles. I think he has fought for them. And I think he's a true believer. Everything I've seen about his entire course of life, I think he believes genuinely, earnestly, with all of his heart in government solutions, government control of the economy in our lives, and in redistribution of wealth. And I have no reason to doubt that the President sleeps like a babe at night, believing that he is fighting to better America. Now, listen, at the same time, I believe that the ideas the President believes in, the policies that he has advanced are profoundly harmful. Not a little bit wrong, but profoundly harmful to this country. But you know what? That's a debate we can have. That's a policy debate I welcome. Has it been good or bad for Americans to implement Obamacare? Has it been good or bad for Americans to see jobs drying up? Has it been good or bad for Americans to see small businesses not growing anymore? Has it been good or bad for Americans to see health insurance premiums skyrocketing? Has it been good or bad for Americans to see more and more people losing their health insurance? That's a debate I'm happy to have on the substance. But that's an honest debate. Look, the President embraces that policy. I'll confess, what produces more of the cynicism, the skepticism towards Washington are the politicians that don't have the honest debates. The politicians who don't say, you know what, I'm not all that fond of Obamacare, but it doesn't matter enough to me to risk anything on it. I care more about staying in office than I do actually about fighting a fight. And so I want to take some symbolic votes, and I don't want to risk any chance of anyone blaming me for the downside. You know, I get why voters are frustrated with that. I get why voters are frustrated when politicians say one thing and do another. It shouldn't be complicated. Do what you say. It shouldn't be complicated. Stand up for your principles. If you don't believe Obamacare should be funded, if you believe Obamacare is hurting Americans, then stand up and say, let's defund Obamacare. And I've made very clear, we could end this debate tonight. We could end this debate right now if the majority leader would come down and, number one, say, look, the best way to end this debate would be as if he would agree to pass the House continuing resolution to fund all of government except for Obamacare. That would be the best way. I recognize that's not likely to happen anytime soon. But it would be the best way. It would be the way most responsive to the American people. But the second way to end this debate, and by the way, to expedite this whole process, is to simply have the majority leader agree to have open amendments and have those amendments subject to a 60-vote threshold. Now, Mr. President, let me point out, you and I have both been here the same number of months, 9 months. During the time we've been here, we've seen vote after vote after vote at 60-vote thresholds. That is very, very common. Mr. President, you will remember the guns debate that we had. Look, guns is an emotional issue. It's a passionate issue. It's an issue people on both sides carry a lot about. I get that. You'll remember when we voted on the floor of this Senate, every single amendment was subject to a 60-vote threshold. In the course of that debate, I introduced, along with Senator Chuck Grassley, the Grassley-Cruz bill. It's a law enforcement alternative. It was, instead of restricting the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, it was targeting violent criminals. It was going after felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy guns. It was going after those who commit violent crimes with guns. It was going after states that don't report mental health records to the background check system. We just saw a horrific shooting in Washington, D.C. All of us are mourning for the victims and the families there. But an individual that it appears has significant mental health issues. Grassley-Cruz bill would have put significant incentives and penalties for states to get them to report mental health records. Because you know what? Our background check system doesn't work if you don't have the mental health records in them. And as of a date relatively recently, I don't recall the date off the top of my head, but relatively recently this year, I believe there were 18 states that had reported 100 or few records. Now, Mr. President, you'll recall what happened with that bill and every amendment. We got a majority of senators voted for the Grassley-Cruz bill. Indeed, 9 Democrats voted for the Grassley-Cruz bill. It was the most bipartisan of any of the comprehensive gun legislation that was considered by this body. There was no other comprehensive bill that had anywhere close to that level of bipartisan support across the aisle. And yet the Grassley-Cruz bill did not pass into law. It didn't even get sent over to the House. Why? Because there was a 60-vote threshold. Because effectively, Majority Leader Reid filibustered it. Now, as important as guns are, I think restoring jobs in the economy, restoring economic growth, dealing with the train wreck that is Obamacare, is at least as important to the American people. And the idea that somehow a 60-vote threshold was okay there, but here there has to be a partisan exercise of brute power, in my view, is completely inconsistent with the traditions of this great body. But I would note, it serves the purposes of politicians on both sides of the aisle. It serves the purposes of Democrats because most Democrats right now still want to preserve Obamacare. Most Democrats, in my view, are privately getting more and more nervous about the train wreck that this is. They're seeing, you can't go home and talk to your constituents without seeing the job loss and the health insurance premiums going up and the people losing their health insurance coverage. So I think most Democrat senators are nervous about it, but not yet ready to abandon ship. And on the Republican side, there's not a Republican here who doesn't enjoy giving speeches about Obamacare. Boy, we can give speeches, humdingers sometimes. But there are more than a few Republicans who are nervous about actually doing anything that has a real chance of happening, because there's, look, any time you take a stand that has risk, there's downside risk. If we hold our ground on this, if the House holds their ground on this, it's entirely possible that Majority Leader Harry Reid and President Obama will force a government shutdown. I don't think they should. I think that'd be a mistake. But they publicly said they're willing to shut the government down in order to force Obamacare on the American people. And that has a lot of members on the Republican side of the conference nervous because they think, well, President Obama and Harry Reid shut the government down. They'll blame it on Republicans. And the media will all repeat that attack. And listen, the mainstream media, every one of them will repeat word for word the talking points. It will get to the point that the stories we read in the major newspapers will read as if they were written by the White House press office. But you know what? That's been the way of the world a long time. And so there are Republicans nervous about, well, even if the President and Harry Reid force a shutdown, Republicans will get blame, and we don't want the political blame, so we don't want to fight this fight. And in fact, a lot of Republicans have gone out to the press and said, we can't win, we can't win, we can't win. Well, you know, when you've got a lot of Republicans saying you can't win, that's one way to make it less likely you're going to win. And it is true, if Republicans don't stand together on this, we can't win. Some have asked, why haven't Democrats come over to join us? Listen, Mr. President, You and I both know no Democrat's going to come join us as long as half the Republican conference is split and throwing rocks at us. There's no incentive for anyone to do that now. The only hope of bringing Democrats over to join us is if we first unify Republicans. We get all 46 Republicans to stand together opposing cloture to say no. We're not going to let Harry Reid shut down all amendments. We're not going to let Harry Reid fund Obamacare in a straight partisan party line vote. And then, if those Democrats elected in red states begin hearing from their constituents in incredible numbers, listen, I'll tell you, the people of Arkansas, the people of Louisiana, the people of North Carolina, they understand Obamacare's a train wreck. They would like their senators to listen to them. And you and I both know when you start to hear from 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 of your constituents, it changes your calculus. If there's one thing the men and women in this body like, it's to get reelected. The only way this fight is going to be won is if the American people speak so loudly that the politicians in this office have no choice but listen to the people. And let me give an example that, Mr. President, you and I spoke about at the time. About a month ago, we all remember that President Obama publicly announced his intention to launch a unilateral military attack on the nation of Syria. Now, when that happened, bipartisan leaders in both the House and Senate fairly quickly came out and supported that plan. And just about every commentator, just about every talking head in Washington said there was no chance of stopping it. It was going to happen. It was a done deal. It was going to happen. In fact, it was the same voices who are saying now with regard to defunding Obamacare, can't be done, nothing to be done, can't be done, accept it, can't be done. All of those exact same voices with Syria said he's going to attack, nothing you can do, can't be done. Now, Mr. President, you and I both spoke out loudly initially saying that the President should bring that issue to Congress. And I, at the time and now, commend the President for listening to bipartisan calls. That was not easy. I have no doubt there were significant dissension among his advisors who didn't want him to do so. And I commend the President for listening to those bipartisan calls. It was the right thing to do. And once he submitted it to Congress, what happened next, you and I both know, because you and I both went home to our respective states. The people in our states were not evenly divided on the question of Syria. It wasn't a close call. I can tell you in my office, the calls literally went 100 to 1 against the United States launching a unilateral military attack against Syria, getting involved in that sectarian civil war in a way that didn't further our national security. We had over 5,000 calls from Texans opposing getting us in the middle of that Syrian civil war. We had roughly 50 in support of it. I think the percentage in our office at one point was 99.13% of the calls were against military intervention. And we saw something even more incredible. Everyone said it was a done deal. The Senate was going to vote to approve it. And the more the American people spoke up, the more people began listening. The more people in this body began listening. The more some of those who early on were fans of the military intervention suddenly began listening to their constituents and saying, I'm not so sure this makes sense. And then astonishingly, remarkably, and I give him credit for this, the President of the United States listened. And the President went before this nation and asked this body, do not vote on this. And I'm glad he did, because if we had voted, I think at that point it was very clear that he would have lost the vote, that Congress would not have voted to authorize military force. The House clearly would have voted against it, and I think there's a good chance the Senate would have also, although the Senate votes were a little harder to predict. But I'm glad the President asked us to call off that vote, because, look, I don't think it's good for this country for Congress to vote against the Commander-in-Chief on issues of national security and defending this nation. So I'm glad we didn't have that vote, but I'm glad he listened to the American people. And I want to point out for everyone who says defunding Obamacare is impossible, They're the same voices that said stopping the Syria attack was impossible. The exact same voices, all of the media graybeards. The only thing that's going to change the dynamic in this body, the only thing that's going to unite 41 Republicans against cloture, against allowing Harry Reid to fund Obamacare, is if the voice of the people becomes so loud that it can't be ignored. And the only thing that's going to start moving red state Democrats is if the voice of the people in their states becomes so loud it cannot be ignored. And ultimately, that's how we win this fight. It comes down to the people. Now, Mr. President, I'd also like to have a bit of a discussion on an issue that I would note Mr. President and Senator Lee both care about and are quite expert on, which is constitutional law and the separation of powers. Now, we have often seen pundits go on television, and they use a phrase that I think is particularly asinine. They say Republicans cannot expect to, fill in the blank here, defund Obamacare, cut taxes, push tax reform, have regulatory reform, do anything. Republicans cannot expect to X because we control just 1/2 of 1/3 of the government. The only thing that Republicans have in Washington is a majority in the House, and you can't do anything from 1/2 of 1/3 of the government. Mr. President, there's a technical legal term for that argument. It's poppycock. It is complete and utter nonsense. That's not the way our constitutional system works. It is true that Democrats currently have a majority in the Senate, that a Democrat sits in the White House. That's true. But the Constitution gives different branches different responsibilities. And in their respective spheres, each branch has exceptional power. So when it comes, Mr. President, to ordering our military troops in battle, to selecting targets, to making direct decisions of military conflict, the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief. And it does not matter if the President is a Democrat, whether 535 members of Congress are Republicans. When it comes to being Commander-in-Chief, when it comes to ordering our troops into battle, to making decisions in the midst of conducting war, the Constitution gives the President preeminent authority on that under Article 2. When it comes to adjudicating the constitutionality of a law, you could make arguments about whether this is right or not, but as a practical matter, the Constitution and modern acceptance gives the Supreme Court preeminence in adjudicating whether a law comports with the Constitution. And I would note that is true even if 5 justices on the court are appointed by a different political party than the party that controls both houses of Congress and the presidency. You could have 5 justices appointed by a Democratic president and 535 Republican members of Congress and a Republican president, and yet on questions of adjudicating the constitutionality of a law, the Supreme Court would still have preeminence and very significant authority. And when it comes to appropriations, when it comes to the power of the purse, when it comes to spending, Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress preeminence, and in particular the House of Representatives. So I'll be perfectly honest, if I were to pick one thing for Republicans to have control of, particularly when it comes to funding or defunding something, it would be the House of Representatives. And every pundit that goes on television and says, well, we just control 1/2 of 1/3 of the government, what complete and utter nonsense. You know what? Not a single law can pass into law without the House of Representatives. It is a necessary but-for. And on questions of spending, The House of Representatives has preeminence. So this notion that it can't be done, that's, and a related point. There's some on the Democratic side of the aisle who make the argument, this is the settled law of the land. Accepted already. You guys are bitter enders. We passed it into law, we won a presidential election again, game over, you lose. Now look, I understand the political virtue of making that argument. It's always good to convince those who disagree with you to just give up their beliefs. Sometimes those of us on this side of the aisle oblige by doing so. But it's not an argument that has any basis in the Constitution. Is Obamacare currently the law of the land? Of course. It's passed into law. It's on the statute books. No one on this side of the aisle is arguing that it's not. We're arguing that it shouldn't be. That's a very different thing than saying it's not. And Congress has the power of the purse. Congress has the power. I'll finish this point, and then I'm happy to yield for a question. Congress has the power to appropriate. And there's no obligation for Congress to appropriate to fund a law that isn't working. That evidence and experience that what the American people are experiencing has demonstrated it isn't working. And so the House of Representatives, in voting to defund Obamacare while funding the rest of government, is fulfilling its constitutional function. And if this body took up that same gauntlet, kept government funded, never shut down government, funded every aspect of government except for Obamacare because it isn't working and it's hurting the American people, we would be fulfilling our constitutional function as well. Now, I would note the senator from Virginia, I think, rose for a question. I'm happy to yield for a question.
Thank you,
without
Senator.
yielding the floor.
I would ask the senator to yield for a series of questions around two issues. First, comments that you made earlier about helpful reforms that could be made to the health care system. And second, your comments about the need for members of this body to listen to their constituents. Being in the chair and hearing you, I couldn't resist but follow up on those two items. On the issue of reform, I understood one of your points to be that a helpful reform might be for Congress to take up and potentially eliminate the current prohibition of purchasing insurance across state lines. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that is correct. And I'm happy to yield for a second question without yielding the floor.
Right. In addition, I think I understood, and I agreed with a comment that you made about potential reforms, that even the whole notion of health care provided through employers is a little bit of a historical anomaly that came up in the aftermath of World War II. I wasn't sure if you were suggesting that as part of a health care reform you would want to alter that norm of employers providing at least some health care provision for their employees.
I thank you for that question. What I was suggesting is we should do tax reform that encourages policies to be personal and portable. And right now, federal tax laws, federal laws heavily favor employer-provided health insurance, and that creates some real failures in the market where when someone loses their job, they lose their health insurance. We would be better serving, I believe, our constituents if health insurance became like car insurance, something that went with you regardless of what job you were in.
Senator, you engaged in a colloquy with the senator from Illinois about a provision that I wanted to follow up on. Prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, it was completely lawful and, in fact, common for insurance companies to turn down individuals for insurance because of pre-existing health conditions. I don't think, but I want to make sure about this, I don't think you were arguing that we should go back to that day and that we should go back to a status quo where children would be turned down for health insurance because of pre-existing health care conditions.
Well, I thank you for that question, and let me point out that pre-existing conditions and the individual mandate of Obamacare are integrally connected. Because the way the insurance market works, let me take an example that doesn't deal with health insurance. Let's talk about fire insurance. Fire insurance on your home. I suspect you and I both, our homes have fire insurance. Imagine if Congress were to pass a law that says fire insurance companies cannot take into account pre-existing conditions, such as whether the home is already burned down in a fire. Now, if that were the law, what any rational person would do is you and I would both cancel our fire insurance policies because our house hasn't burned down, and if it did burn down, we could then go buy a fire insurance policy and say, please pay for my house. Now, under that rule, the whole insurance regime collapses because the entire basis of insurance is you get people whose homes haven't burned down to pay relatively small premiums to create a pool of capital that will be used to compensate. We don't know who, but somebody's home is going to burn down, and if enough people whose home hasn't burned down put in money and premiums, there will be a pool to pay for whichever unlucky soul faces their home burning down. The health insurance market works quite similarly, which is if the rule is simply anyone, regardless of their medical condition, any insurance company has to cover them no matter what. The incentive is the same as with fire insurance, that if you and I are healthy, it's frankly irrational to get health insurance if the rule is, well, if I get sick, then I can get health insurance and they have to cover me. What you end up with is insurance that consists only of people who have sicknesses, who have grave diseases, and that bankrupts every insurance plan. If you have a mandate that you can't take into account whether someone is already sick before giving them insurance, it means the insurance companies go out of business, and what it leads to is what Majority Leader Reid has argued for. It leads ultimately to single-payer government health insurance.
Excuse me, does the Affordable Care Act require that insurance be provided to folks with, despite pre-existing conditions, at the same rate across the board?
It restricts the terms at which the rates are given.
So then, to make sure I understand, you are opposed to the provision in the current Affordable Care Act that requires insurance companies to write insurance to individuals within those limitations, regardless of pre-existing conditions.
Well, let me finish my explanation on that. I will answer your question, but I want to finish the explanation. That's the reason why Obamacare includes the individual mandate. Because to use the fire example again, it would be the equivalent of if you're saying you got to issue a fire policy to anyone regardless of whether their house is already burned down or not. It would be the equivalent of saying, well, but we're requiring everyone who has a house has got to buy a policy. Because that's the only way you prevent the insurance market from being bankrupted. So the individual mandate, the reason why Obamacare says we're forcing everyone to buy insurance, whether you want to or not, is because of the pre-existing condition. Now listen, my view on pre-existing conditions is we ought to reform the market to deal with that problem. I don't think Obamacare is the right solution. I think Obamacare is the wrong solution. I think we ought to defund it all now, and I think we ultimately ought to repeal it in its entirety. But on pre-existing conditions, I'll point out, number one, if you have an issue, I mean, there have been issues with insurance companies acting in bad faith, with insurance companies dropping someone when they get sick. And I think there the legal system should work to prevent that. If you've purchased insurance, if you've paid your premiums, your company should not be dropping you when you become sick. And I think there's a vital role for state insurance regulators to be involved there and for our contract and tort system, the legal system, to be involved there. And I think if we move towards changing the federal tax laws to make health insurance policies portable, personal, it will go a long, long way to solving the problem of pre-existing conditions. Now, I'm not maintaining it will solve it in every instance 100% of the time. It's very difficult to come up with a federal rule that will address 100% of the inequitable circumstances you could come up with, and if you tried to, the unintended consequences can be staggering. You know, Obamacare was justified in terms of wanting to provide insurance for those without insurance. Listen, I'd like to see those without insurance get health insurance. I'd like to see a competitive market where low-cost catastrophic policies were attractive to people and they chose to purchase it. But, you know, one of the best ways for someone to get health insurance is for them to get a good job, for them to actually start making real money, have some disposable income, start climbing the economic ladder. And the unintended consequence of Obamacare is it's ended up hammering economic growth, hammering small businesses. And so a lot of the people that the law was trying to help, have been made worse off.
Senator, if I could, let me ask you, a reform in your view that might encompass a different solution for the pre-existing condition, or an ending of the ban on interstate purchasing of insurance. If we get through this week and we're into next week and Obamacare hasn't been defunded and we have funded government operations going forward, you could introduce a reform bill proposing to do just those things, couldn't you?
I thank the Senator for that question. I could, and I will confess, our policy team is working on a number of health insurance reform affirmative policies. Now, I will confess, and for some reason we're kind of going with the home fire analogies, so let's stick with it right now. There's some that in the course of health care matters argue that the heavy focus of those of us who are opposed to Obamacare should be what's the alternative, that should be the heavy focus. And listen, I absolutely think the health care system needs reforms to change real problems in it. I'm a strong believer in that. But an analogy I've used before is if your home is on fire, you put out the fire first before building an addition to the house. Likewise with Obamacare, I think Obamacare is such a train wreck, it's such a disaster that the first imperative is to stop the damage from Obamacare, and then I think we should work, and I'd like it to be in a bipartisan way. You and I have talked many times about how we could work together. We have yet to find a great opportunity to do so, but I am hopeful that will change, because I'd like to see us listen to our constituents and work constructively to fix the problems that hardworking Americans are struggling with. And so, when it comes to introducing affirmative health care legislation, I fully anticipate that our team will do so, and we are working on proposals now. As you know well, our having been here just 9 months, it has been not a quiet 9 months.
And Senator, if we get to that point, and you introduce affirmative legislation to reform the health care system after we get through this debate, that would be legislation that would not be connected to the question, the existential question of whether or not government would continue to operate on October 1st. And so it wouldn't be integrally wrapped up with sort of a threat to the economy that would be posed by potential government shutdown, and it could be analyzed just on its own merits. Is this a good reform or a bad reform, without being wrapped around the question of whether we would shut down the government, and do we lay off or put on some kind of furlough the nurses at Fort Belvoir Hospital who are taking care of wounded warriors every day. That would be a reform bill where we could really dig into the reform and talk about the reform and analyze what's good and what's bad and what should be fixed and maybe what shouldn't be, without it being wrapped around the question of a government shutdown. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, I thank the Senator from Virginia, and I would certainly agree that this body should spend considerable time working and working together on positive, proactive health care reforms to expand competition, to empower patients. And I also agree with something else the Senator from Virginia said, which is that we should not be threatening a government shutdown. I don't want a government shutdown. I want the government to continue. I salute the House of Representatives for passing a continuing resolution that keeps the government funded. But it also defunds Obamacare, and in my view, that is responsive to the suffering that so many millions of Americans are experiencing, to the loss of jobs, to being forced into part-time work, to being facing higher health insurance premiums, to losing their health insurance. And
Senator, would you not agree that the best way to avoid a government shutdown or threats of a government shutdown or talking about the consequences of a government shutdown would be to separate out your question of what are the right reforms of the health care system from the funding of government operations?
Well, I would certainly agree with the Senator from Virginia that we should stop holding hostages. And so an ideal way, and I had an earlier exchange with Senator Enzi from Wyoming, who pointed out that the entire reason we're having this continuing resolution battle is because Congress failed in its job to pass appropriations bills. And so, for example, the House of Representatives has passed a defense authorization, a defense appropriations bill. It is sitting here in the Senate, and Majority Leader Reid has not taken it up. I think we should take it up and pass it immediately, so that any discussion of government shutdowns does not in any way, shape, or form even remotely threaten the salary of the men and women of our military. And I'm confident you and I agree under no circumstances should anyone who is risking his or her life to defend the rest of us find their compensation, their salary threatened. Now, in my view, existing law allows and even requires the President to fund the military regardless of what happens on the continuing resolution, regardless of if we have a partial temporary shutdown.
In your view, is it acceptable for discussion of government shutdown to threaten the non-military priorities that are important to the American public?
I appreciate the question from the senator from Virginia, and I would note, I don't think we should shut anything down except Obamacare. I think we should fund it all, and indeed, I have indicated a willingness. Now, Senator from Virginia knows well that I think we've got a deep spending problem in this country, that Congress has abdicated its responsibility, has built a record debt. It's gone from $10 trillion when the President was elected to now nearly $17 trillion, over a 60% increase. And so, if you ask me, do I like a continuing resolution that funds everything the federal government is doing without having significant spending cuts? No. No, I would much rather have real spending cuts, roll up our sleeves, and address the out-of-control spending and debt. But I'm perfectly willing to vote for a continuing resolution that maintains the status quo on everything, except for Obamacare, because I view the gravity of Obamacare, the threat of Obamacare to hardworking American men and women so grave that, as you know, in politics and life, you've got to pick your battles. You've got to pick your battles one at a time. So over time, I'd like for us to work to have real spending cuts. But I don't think the avenue to doing that is that we should shut down the government. Right. And in my view, we shouldn't shut down the government. And the only way a government shutdown will happen, and it may happen, is if Majority Leader Harry Reid and President Obama decide they want to shut down the government in order to force Obamacare on the American people.
So, Senator, you will not vote to continue government operations unless Obamacare is defunded.
The senator from Virginia is correct that I have stated that I will not vote for a continuing resolution that funds Obamacare. And I believe this body shouldn't vote for a continuing resolution that funds Obamacare. Why? Because the facts show it isn't working. That's why the unions, who used to support it, are one after the other coming out against it.
Senator, I want to switch and ask you a question about the Make Washington Listen. That's the second piece. I gather, if you'll let me get back into a little bit of campaigning activity, you and I were candidates at the same time in 2012. I gather that you told your constituents that you were opposed to Obamacare and that you would vote to repeal or defund it if you were elected to office. Is that correct?
That is most assuredly correct.
And I believe I'm correct that you won your election not by a small margin, but by a large margin. Is that correct?
Thanks to the work of a whole lot of Texans, men and women across the state who really worked their hearts out. Yes, we were privileged to win the primary by 14 points and to win the general election by 16 points.
And would it be fair to say that part of your mission here is you told your voters what you would do, and they knew what you would do and chose you to do the job, and one of the things you're doing today on the floor with this effort is to basically live up to the promise that you made to them and the mandate that they gave to you?
I would agree with all of that.
Let me offer you a hypothetical situation. Contemplate another state and another race between two candidates where one candidate took the strong position that Obamacare should be repealed and the other candidate took the strong position that Obamacare should not be repealed. And in that state, the candidate that won by a sizable margin was the candidate who said Obamacare should not be repealed. Having been plain about it with the voters, and the voters having heard the choices and made a choice, do you think it's also the case that a senator in that hypothetical state should come to the body and do what he said he was going to do to his voters?